Hi everyone, you're all very welcome to this talk. I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight. Just say a few words about Paul Leech, and he will introduce our guests. Paul Leech is a founding member of GAIA International, a working network of ecological architects, engineers, scientists in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, UK, the USA, Bhutan, Australia and Ireland. Regarded by some of his eminent peers as among Ireland's premier ecological architects, Paul loves to design buildings which really meet the user's needs and in which people feel comfortable and want to spend time. He has designed many projects ranging from dwellings and apartments, creches to office buildings, facilities for the elderly to supermarkets, even a micro-hydro power plant in an old mill. As he put it himself, sustainable building, ecological architecture really is the way of the future. It's not considered optional anymore. Indeed, Paul has been one of the pioneers of that in Ireland, and he has helped disseminate it all over the world, speaking in Europe, Africa, India, China, USA, Australia, and Japan. Last but not least, Paul is also a painter, and he has shown in various places, such as the RHA Annual and the Hendrix Gallery. He has been painting all his adult life, mostly in watercolors, his favorite medium.
Thank you very much, Olivier. That is too long an introduction for me. So, Olivier himself has been around for a while. Ollie Art has been on the go in Dublin since 2004. And the OCG, as it's affectionately known, was originally in the wooden building in Temple Bar, moved to Cavendish Row and fetches up here in Great Denmark Street. He's noted by Aidan Dunn as having a knack for curating good thematic shows, allowing artists to affiliate their work to a subject without distorting their practice. I think those two things are very important. Tomorrow he's off at crack of dawn to Belfast with Eoin Lochlainn, who's here, and Claire Halpin, who have co-curated a show called Concerning the Other, and it's having another outing there at the Queen Street Studios. And later this year it will be in the City Assembly House in the Octagonal Room, and then in the Táin Art Centre in February. So it's a wonderful exhibition which you probably may know something about, those of you who attend the gallery. So I think Olivier is to be congratulated for the conception of this show, and perhaps you'd say one or two words about just how did it come to be.
I curate an art exhibition every year for the Vue Art Fair, which is Ireland's national contemporary art fair at the RHA Dublin. And because I represent a very diverse group of artists, I have to come up with a broad theme every year. And 2 years ago at Vue, at the art fair, we had the theme was Baudelaire's poetry. And the fair finished on November the 6th. That was 2 days before the presidential election in the USA. Donald Trump was elected on the 8th of November. And on the 6th of November at Vue, I heard on the radio that Trump was talking about climate change, and obviously we know what he thinks about it. And I think I looked at Eoin and I said, that's it. Next year for Vue, we're doing a show on climate change. Now, at the time, one of my artists, actually two of my artists, were already working on the theme. John Fitzsimons had been producing a body of work which was in response to climate change. Jordi Fornies had attended this residency on board a shipping vessel around the Arctic Circle and had taken wonderful photographs of glacier melting away. So that's how the show came about. And I think in January last year, when Mr. Donald Trump took office in the White House, I just heard that the first thing I think that his staff removed from the website, one of the two first things, was the reference to climate change. I think that day I sent my mail to all the artists about the theme of the show. So that's how it came about. So I have to thank Mr. Donald Trump for the idea of the show.
Okay, so first of all, can I say that the purpose of this is dialogue. So if as people are speaking, do interrupt, ask a question, contradict, make an observation. That's welcome rather than waiting for them and us sort of process. So before I introduce one at a time our participants here in this panel discussion, when I had seen Yanny's work, whom I will introduce in a moment, Sally and I associated what she had done with a poem. And the interesting thing about the artistic imagination is the way that it segues, makes allusions. It's oblique and finds its way to the essence or core. So with your permission, I'll read this very short poem by Michael Longley. Rum and raisin, vanilla, butterscotch, walnut, peach. You would rhyme off the flavors. That was before they murdered the ice cream man on the Lisburn Road. And you bought carnations to lay outside his shop. I named for you all the wildflowers of the burn I had seen in one day. Thyme, valerian, loosestrife, meadowsweet, twayblade, crowfoot, ling, angelica, herb robert, marjoram, cow parsley, sundew, vetch, mountain avens, wood sage, ragged robin, stitchwort, yarrow, lady's bedstraw, bindweed, bog, pimpernel. And the association of this poem with what Yanny had done, how she responded to the general space or ethos of the exhibition was intriguing. And Yanny has something to say about her approach and how she got to the work. But it's just to say one or two things by way of introduction from the details on the website. Yanny had a show here in 2016 called Come With Me, I'll Show You Something Beautiful. Coming from Enniskerry in Wicklow, she worked through a process of sign writing and developed a whole range of techniques that were associated with sign writing and brought them to fine art techniques, and particularly the Ver et le Musée technique, which was explored by the Blauer Reiter group, the Blue Rider group, who, given the day it is tomorrow, Munter was one of that group and is relatively unsung compared to men we hear lots about, Kandinsky and Klee and Mark and so on. And they were producing glass paintings in this general technique. So the intriguing thing about that technique is that it's reverse painting. So the precise details, what one would normally think of as finishing touches, go on first. And in this beautiful group of four, Yanny has combined the monoprint technique with the Ver et le Musée. And her work is in several national parks. She's in the Watercolour Society, the Society of Botanical Artists, and she'll be exhibiting at the Seamus Ennis Centre this April, right, co-curated by Olivier. So Yanny, perhaps you would like to say one or two things about how you got to this work.
Well, I suppose generally my work is about raising awareness about the lesser regarded plants. So what everybody thinks are weeds, I just like to highlight. And when Olivier gave us the information about the theme of the exhibition, I started looking at different approaches to how one might highlight an aspect of climate change through depicting plants. So I went through doing alien species, through trying to show how climate change might change a plant, to then coming up with the idea that I would do the ancestral plant to plants that we use every day as vegetables or fruit. So, and then obviously the artist doesn't want to go too far from what they're doing as their discipline. In working with a theme, sometimes you have to work quite hard to make the theme fit how you work, how you're your practice works with that. So I wanted to experiment with using the printmaking. I've been doing quite a lot of using the plants themselves to make nature prints, which is a technique which was explored back in the day of Leonardo da Vinci as a way of illustrating plants for medicinal purposes. And to combine that and the idea of a herbal, which was the early depictions of plants, some of which would have been not actually drawn from nature but from descriptions. It's only in the Middle Ages that we started depicting plants from nature. To combine that idea of getting as much information about a plant into a small piece of paper or vellum or whatever it was at the time, to then also tell the story of the ancient plant which is still with us, but also to show the beauty of the seeds and the flowers. And by using gold leaf and engraving in the flowers and seeds, I want to accentuate the value of the seeds, because in my research, when I honed it down to doing the seeds, showing the plants and their seeds, I looked at various documents online and took out key information. And one of the things was from Emily Beament, who wrote about a report being compiled in Kew Gardens, and just a couple of things from that report. She says many plants are facing extinction because of climate change, as they are responding slowly to rising temperatures and changing rainfall and have limited ways to adapt. And the other thing that caught my eye was the importance of collecting samples of crop wild relatives, cousins of the plants that humans use as common crops, and which may have traits that could make food plants more resilient to a changing climate or pests and diseases. So for me it was the seeds are so tiny, and while we keep the seeds of the cabbages and the carrots and all the things that we have already cultivated to their extreme extent, we ignore the weeds. So, but we might actually genetically have to go back to the weeds to breed stronger plants in the future. So the fact that we don't have them in our seed banks could be a problem. So that was, to keep it short.
Yes,
that's,
okay.
How it came about.
Thank you very much, Yanny. So the second artist from the show we have with us is Hugh Cummins. And Hugh's work is these wonderful raindrops and this bag and perhaps other pieces here. And Hugh is exhibiting in an upcoming show in May with Sheila Naughton, also at the gallery here. And he's working closely with a knowledge of different species, beech and walnut. He's been with John Makepeace's school in Parnham, which anyone who knows about wood, you bow.
Be careful, it was a summer school.
Yeah, that's fine.
Not the full 2 years.
Yeah. But, that association leads people to bow in acknowledgement of that kind of tradition, that ethos. But surprisingly, Hugh has a BA in philosophy and logic, and moreover a diploma in social science. So since this discussion is about interfacing fine art with other dimensions, wider concerns, societal, environmental concerns, this jumped out to me. And after being away in UK for quite a bit, he's back in Ireland since 2001. And perhaps in the same way, Hugh, you might like to just briefly say something about the process of how you came to this work.
All right. Well, I might start with John Makepeace.
Okay.
John Makepeace is a major influence in the UK for furniture making himself, and then having a school in southwest England. I can't remember now, the Dorset at Parnham House, and he had an exhibition in London, in central London, and it was the result of that year's graduates from his school, and it had a major impact on me. I thought, goodness gracious, you can do this with wood. I didn't see anything like that before, and it was that started me on a search to find out how I could do the same or learn how to do the same. But for Olivier's exhibitions sometimes are a real challenge. And sometimes it's extremely difficult to think of something that would match the title and the theme. I had been working on that shape for quite a while. In the first exhibition, I think it was maternal care, I had a bottle that was mahogany and bird's eye maple on the inside, and as it tilted, the level of the medicine, if you like, was then coming out and pouring down into a cup. Because that shape worked so well, I wanted to use it for this exhibition, but much bigger. I had to fairly quickly get to Olivier to say, look, I have a theme of rain. Please, can I do it? So I kind of reserved that. But it was rain really because the wood represents different countries. Australia, North America, South America, Ireland, Europe, Australia, if I mentioned it. And the colours represented different nationalities, so it affects everybody, wherever you are. In some places you're going to get too much rain, you'll be flooded out, harm, damaged crops, housing, people killed. In other places they won't have the rain that they expected to have, and so they're suffering at the other end of the spectrum really. So it was such an important theme in terms of climates that I thought it was something that might affect people and get them to think about it. Mm-hmm. The bag I did was really because it's a challenge, and I wanted people to think of the amount of plastic we use routinely and just take it for granted. And the number of bags that have been issued in the world is in the trillion. And it, as one person wrote, it never goes away. Even if you make new buckets out of the old plastic, it's still going to be plastic. It's still coming from crude oil. And the amount of crude oil used in the making of plastics is phenomenal, absolutely colossal. So I wanted just to get people to think about other ways of doing things. It can carry a couple of bottles of wine maybe and a few baguettes at a push. But it was just really the challenge of getting the wood to do that is what I'm interested in, and different woods have different qualities. You can bend some much more easily than others. Some you touch and they're brittle, and you have to be differently careful of them, Okay. So that's really what led me to do those two things.
Thank you so much. So our third panellist, hosted by Olivier, is Paddy Woodworth. And anyone who's been reading or listening in Ireland knows who Paddy is. He's formerly arts editor of the Irish Times for about 5 years or so. He's an author, journalist. He knows a lot about the Basque Country and matters Iberian generally. And his writing, we see from time to time the Irish Times on ecological issues, and he has a particular focus on ecological restoration. And to kick off the dialogue more widely, Paddy, could I ask you to respond and thread through it, if you would, where you're coming from, as it were, these different dimensions that you're bringing together, this arts sensibility with ecological awareness, and address the question, what on earth has art got to do with climate change?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me, Olivier. It's a very challenging question, and I suppose it does cut across the kind of very odd CV that I have. That I started off almost in tandem, working in the arts in Ireland, and working in and that fairly rapidly morphed into working into arts journalism. I had been a theatre and cinema manager, etc. parallel to that, and how I really cut my teeth as a journalist, was living in the Basque Country on the Spanish side of the border. At the time General Franco died, and what was the supposedly ideal transition to democracy, which of course a large number of Basques, for good or ill, and I think mainly for ill, did not accept, and continued with armed struggle against a now democratic government. And so I had this odd thing where I was writing about the arts in Ireland, but then the arts in Ireland were often very politically engaged. My last job as an arts administrator was to manage translations for Brian Friel and Stephen Ray in Derry City on the eve of the hunger strikes. But I was moving between those two worlds, and also I was at that period politically committed myself to the official Republican movement, and to hardline Marxism basically. So when I come across a question like this today, what on earth has art and artists to do with climate change? I become cautious because of my experience on the hard left of the way, the very problematic relationship between art and issues. And in the end, I come down on the side absolutely of the liberty of the artist, that the artist must have freedom of expression and mustn't be, as artists were under socialist realism, at the service of an ideology. That doesn't mean that an artist doesn't have an ideology or does not engage with those issues, but it's a really, really tricky one. And I think it's interesting that in this exhibition, most artists have approached the theme more or less obliquely, and not directly. Certainly, I don't see anything here that could qualify as agitprop. And I think that's healthy, that's good. On the other hand, I think, and very briefly to explain why I'm talking about environment at all, is that I wrote a book about the conflict in the Basque Country, which kind of catapulted me into American academia. And I was looking for a new subject to write about, something in natural history, because I like birds and I like hiking, but I had no scientific background. And I came across this idea and practice in the American Midwest of ecological restoration. And it's such a it's a clunky phrase, but there really isn't any other phrase to describe what it is, because essentially it is attempting to reverse damage to ecosystems. And I thought you either degraded and destroyed, or you preserved. And the idea that you might be able to restore things was extraordinarily exciting to me, and I spent 10 years looking at restoration projects around the world, and there are some things in common. Restoration is in some ways as much an art as a science. Hugely complicated ecosystems, but in a sense you're making a lot of judgments that may actually be based more on aesthetics, even among scientists, than science. And in preparing for tonight, I looked at what is happening internationally in terms of engaging artists with climate change, and the answer is actually quite a lot. There are if you just Google art and climate change, you come across a number of organisations, and you can see from the websites that very sophisticated work is being produced. One that I was already familiar with is Dark Mountain. I don't know, is anyone familiar with Dark Mountain, the Dark Mountain Manifesto? And this is based on an extremely pessimistic view of where we are at. It essentially argues that civilization as we know it today cannot be sustainable. Most conservation is based on the idea that we can somehow make our societies sustainable, that we can continue to live something like how we live today, and yet not consume more resources than are renewable. The Dark Mountain takes a very pessimistic view. So much of the art produced, mainly literature, but there is quite a bit of visual art now coming out of Dark Mountain, is based on what they call uncivilization. And a lot of it is very dark, dystopian visions of what the near future may be like. And maybe that's right. I don't go along that road, but it's an interesting one to look at. And finally, I would just mention, I can come back to this later because I don't want to speak for too long at a time, is that I have been very lucky, I think, to be invited to work with 3 Irish artists who are very actively engaged in their whole practice with the environment. And I could speak a bit later about their work, if you like. And we do a kind of travelling roadshow, which, again, to show the lack of interest, doesn't travel that much, which is called ceathach, which is the Irish word for plot, as in plot of land. And it's also in a kind of punning way called insight, because it's about relationships with places and what happens in places. I just mentioned one of the artists to start with, Monica de Bath, who has spent most of her recent artistic life making studios out of workers' huts on bogs. So she lives and works among Bordnamona people and engages with them about what they're doing. And she has a rather wonderful phrase, I think, she says, art leads us into a meditative state where our own ideas encounter other ideas. And I think that's maybe a helpful way of looking at how artists might engage with climate change. It's not about telling us to consume less or telling us anything really, but maybe it's a way of using the imagination to lead us into places where we may have to encounter very awkward and painful contradictions, like the Bordnamona worker who says, I know what I'm doing is bad for the environment, but if you close down the Bordnamona power plants today, you will kill life in many small towns in the Midlands. Now, you may say climate change is going to kill those towns anyway. But, you know, how many of us are prepared to mortgage our present and the next 10 years for what life may be like in 50 years' time? So Monica kind of very much moves between those poles. She doesn't advocate any particular range of activity. She rather tries type of action. She rather tries to look at the whole range of activities that are happening in a place with an artist's eye and engage with all of those activities and make us perhaps think about them in different ways.
So if I could a little mischievously bounce this onto the floor of the house, so to speak. Eoin is sitting there, avoiding my gaze. But I noticed in the blurb about Eoin's membership here, you know, he's a gallery artist. And Eoin's steeped in media references by his own account. But he explores how art may produce a deeper, a more enduring understanding of contemporary experience. So, how did you get to the jellyfish?
Well, there used to be 2 jellyfish in Ireland as far as I remember. There was a little purple one that was harmless, and then there was a brown one that you had to avoid or you'd get a sting from. And just in recent years, trying to get a swim in Dublin is impossible almost because there's all these signs up about new jellyfish arriving in. Like it's to do with the water heating and new species coming in. Simple as that really. Those jellyfish might be nice to look at, but they're not supposed to be here. They're only here because the water has the temperature has risen. You know, that's really
very, very beautiful work, and the sensibility in the work, you know, speaks. It's interesting. I'd like to suggest that one answer to the question as the title for this discussion is nothing to do, for the reasons that Paddy touched on, that in a way an artist's work is sui generis. It's an arcane process whereby media are entered into, have a generating power in the hands and mind and soul of the artist. And this journey is their own. It is autonomous. It is fiercely independent. The moment art begins to preach or be solemn, unduly solemn or didactic, it's in trouble. So fine art has always averred this liberty. And you can say that fine art has nothing to do with climate change. And perhaps some of the panel would like to respond to that suggestion.
The one thing I would say is that when I presented the exhibition, I think the short description for it was an artist's response to climate change. But I'm not sure that is actually a response. It's more like I think a lot of the artists are actually asking questions. I remember, and I should have said that in my introduction, this exhibition was actually supported by the EPA. And the EPA, for instance, was very impressed with Hugh Cummins' bag, what's the title again? Beyond the bag.
Thinking beyond the bag.
Thinking beyond the bag. This idea that the artist is not giving us any answers, but it's basically asking more questions. You know, the question. In fact, so many people have come to this exhibition, and in a lot of cases, we started a lot of conversations about plastic bags. And I think that's one of the questions that Hugh is asking. You know, yes, plastic bags are not the answers, but paper bags are not the answer either. And you know, the whole debate about plastic bags in Ireland for me is a very interesting one, for instance. And so many conversations have happened in the gallery around that piece. And to John what Woodworth is saying, again, there's no response, but there's so many questions that have been asked. The question that I have, for instance, Ireland was the first country to introduce a levy on plastic bags, and you know, at the time we all rejoiced about it. Now some countries have gone further. I was in France for Christmas. You go to a supermarket in France, you get a bag in your supermarket for free. It looks like plastic, but it isn't plastic. It's biodegradable. So some countries have moved forward, and that, for me, that piece is interesting because again, it's not a response. It's asking more questions. We all need to think beyond the box, and I think that's what artists can do: is react and ask even more questions. For me, to ask myself questions. So I would not expect artists to come up with responses. It's more like, let's ask even more questions.
I would agree with Olivier that I think a more effective piece of art is not one that makes a statement, but one that makes you think. So everyone takes their own story from each piece of art. So if you over-describe it or over-analyse it, you're flattening it. So I would think, you know, I love the combination of work here because everybody's is so different, and you see all sorts of different thought processes, and everyone who views it individually can take their own story from it. So that's what's really effective, I would think.
How do you feel about that, Joe?
Well, making the bag has changed me and changed the family, because we can't go shopping now with a plastic bag at all. So we've come to cloth bags and canvas bags that we had around the place, but we wash them all and have them in the car so that they're available, because it's so easy just to pick up a plastic bag, you know. So it has changed me quite a bit. And also we're within the house thinking about the plastic we use wherever, you know, and how much we take in from Sainsbury's and or Tesco's and places like that. And it does, as Yanny says, get you thinking about it. That's all it is, you know. It won't change you, but it'll change something. It'll change a little bit, you know.
But just to come at it from a different angle. We talk a lot about plastic, and we talk a lot about what we as humans are doing to the planet. But we've caused the climate change. But to talk about what we're doing with the resources isn't really the answer. There's something more to it that we need to do. We need to live differently to address those issues. We're not going to change climate back. We need to change how we live. So whether it's using oil or whatever it is.
So is anyone else offering on this question? Well, yes, okay.
I just think it's fantastic what you were saying about your own personal change in your house, that you're over use cloth bags now. And I think one thing that an artist does is in exploring some form of knowledge, you learn a lot. And I think it's something that maybe a wider audience could do is seek and investigate like an artist and maybe discover something new about the environment or how individually we can change. I just think the artist inquiry is a template that can be transferred to a different member of the public, just to complement on your own investigation.
Well, one topic I'd like to raise is that I get upset with greenwash, that there's a genuine changing of the community's awareness. We've had Ophelia, we've now had Emma and the Beast. People. It's funny how these things are just named, but it is really getting through to people. 3-meter snowdrifts in March. People are noticing the question about water and so on. But the point I want to raise, and I'm intrigued by responses in the room, is that there's a tendency on the market side to banalize this process and to package it and greenwash it or commodify it in a way that owns that process. In our area, Sally and I work in ecological design, but we get upset with passive house branding and quite ugly buildings which have claims to very high energy performance. But speaking personally, I just speak in the first person, they are not art. The act of habitation, space, light, proportion, form, all of the media of place making are banalized by systems like LEED Platinum or BREEAM or Passive House. These are used as yardsticks. They're owned by the market. They're subverted in the actual intention. And my point is that I have a feeling that fine art interrogates this banality. It challenges pat greenwash marketing. And I'm wondering if that resonates with anybody else.
Well, I'd say everything is monetarized, and even nature is being monetarized because that's how people read its value. And so if somebody said, well, those carrot seeds are worth 50 euros each, then everybody's going to look at that picture and say, okay, well, that's worth something now. But if it's just a little speck in a bag of 100 of them, they're just, it's only a few little things. So I think because everything is being monetarized, one set of people sit up and others become more cynical. I don't know. Maybe it's not the answer, but does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
I'd just like to say, as not really perhaps an artist, but an architect, and a member of the public, I suppose, that I think artists have a role that they may or may not accept, they're being offered a role. But there is a role for art in general to express a lot of emotional content, which vast majority of people don't have the ability or capability to put down in any way, and that can be quite often music, frankly, but certainly visual art sometimes can capture a mass feeling of unease in this case, perhaps, rather than the dystopian extremity, which I think is fine as long as you're a strong man in your 20s in the whole of your health. But if you were elderly or infirm or had any disability, you wouldn't like a dystopian future at all. You wouldn't be the pioneer or the survivalist that would survive. So if you're thinking as a society and how society can help each other to change, to make transformation, then art is transformative. Is kind of the shorthand of what I'm trying to say, is that it is possible to express and capture something and put it over in a way that words couldn't do. And I think that would be a goal, or a very unattainable goal probably, but in little pockets it could happen. Would
you like to pick that up, Paddy? You said you were particularly in relation to this these three artists, and your reference to dystopian, demotivating. Dystopia is demotivating.
Well, that's why I found restoration so exciting, was because it was a different narrative from the environmental movement, that we can make things better. But every time I speak about restoration, I always add a rider that is very much linked to what you're saying, that, and here it is much more difficult to be optimistic, that unless, I would say it's not just a matter of changing how we live, we've actually got to change our values. And our values are, the values of unregulated capitalism are how it perpetuates itself is on the idea that we become happier by consuming or owning more stuff. And, we know what the figures are, what the resources are now, and the impacts on climate. That if everybody in Rwanda, and if I can live like this in Ireland, why can't somebody in Rwanda live like that? Why can't somebody in Thailand, etc., etc., etc.? That, and that is what is happening. All those countries are moving towards our kind of way of life. And that unless there is a value change and a change in how we relate to each other, which is hard to be optimistic about, I think things are certainly going to get much worse before they get better. But I would like to pick up the point from the back of the room about extending it a bit beyond artists, to in fact perhaps appealing to the artist, the creator, and the inquisitive. Because I think art is about two things in a way. It's about creation and it's about curiosity. And a hell of a lot more, obviously. But that if you can engage people's curiosity and creativity, and so coming to your point about the artists I've been working with, another is Gareth Kennedy, and he gives a very clear idea of engaging people who aren't necessarily or don't think of themselves as artists through his kind of public art working with environmental issues. And one of the issues he's looked at a lot, and he's produced, and I have it here if anyone wants to look at it now or afterwards, a book called Post Colony, which is about rhododendron in Killarney National Park, which is a huge problem. People don't know about it. It's an invasive alien plant that essentially, if it is allowed spread in our oak forest, it destroys the oak forest and becomes the only plant in that, an oak forest which contains always a number of other trees and many plants. Rhododendron, just long story short, and to oversimplify, wipes everything else out over time. And it's rampant in Killarney National Park. And there is a lot of controversy over how to manage it. Very sad controversy in my view. But what Gareth does, one of the things Gareth does is to essentially heighten awareness of this problem, is he creates, you can call it craft, you can call it art, but he creates, for example, furniture out of rhododendron. And he engages people in the community working with that. He goes back, he also kind of investigates the kind of deep social and ecological history of the park. And charcoal making is so important in so many Irish woodlands. And you go into Irish woodlands, even ones that are still relatively unspoiled, but actually they've been managed by human beings over many, many generations. And I think that's, we need to be more visually literate to appreciate art better. We need to be more ecologically literate to appreciate landscapes. I grew up thinking that the woods in Glendalough were primeval oak forest. And I then realised that no, 100 years ago there were no trees in Glendalough. And so I thought, well, they were cut down for the mines. And then I went into the history of the mining and I found that the mining companies had planted 1 million trees in Glendalough in the 18th and 19th centuries. So somebody else had cleared the forest first. So, and that in a way is also a lesson about the resilience of nature, that it can come back, though under climate change it's going to come back very differently. But I think those ideas of, so Gareth Kennedy in Killarney engages archaic, recuperates archaic ways of manufacturing carbon using rhododendron as the material. And these become kind of social events and lots of people come to them. And so there is that kind of engagement. And that perhaps is one area where art can reach out to more people than perhaps, with no disrespect, than art on a gallery wall. That there is a need for that sort of engagement for artists if artists are to make a significant social difference. And I know I'm probably contradicting myself. I mean, a bit of me wants to see art actively socially engaged, but the danger is when it becomes prescriptive. So that's a tension, I think, that we live in.
So one way of approaching this is to think about indigenous art. Now, if you look at the Aboriginal painting, the dot paintings, and extraordinary culture of connectedness to land, their sense of what they call country, the song lines and so on, all of that awareness. Now, you've worked in Africa, in Malawi, and what I'm intrigued to hear you on, if you would, is this connection between contemporary fine art practice, which is what you're dealing with month to month, year to year, and a reconnection with indigenous arts which speak of bush tucker. The fact that Mali had multi-story, 6-7-story cities when we were in rather primitive state, and that these lost cultures had a connectedness. Tragically, many resulted in the collapse of civilizations because of the overworking of resources. But I'm just asking you, Olivier, to maybe comment on this connection with, for example, African indigenous arts, and how that connects with contemporary practice.
I don't know about that, because, and again, I don't know that much about, contemporary art practices in Africa, but when I was in Africa, I was managing a cultural centre there, and I did organise art exhibitions. But the type of art exhibitions I organised were, we show the type of art that we Europeans are interested in, this idea that we still think sometimes that, African art is very traditional art, and when you look at contemporary practices in Africa, they have a lot of concerns that we have in Europe, pollution, the environment. So I think sometimes in the Western world we have this idea that indigenous art is all about sort of being in touch with the ancestors and everything. There is certainly an aspect of that, but I think it's a bit of a cliche for me, to be honest with you. And I think a lot of African artists have the same concerns that artists, when asked to respond to something like that, would have. I mean, you look at what, if you visit contemporary exhibitions by African artists, I mean, you'd be surprised that they deal with subjects such as pollution and other aspects that European artists would be dealing with. So I don't know about that, to be honest with you.
About the connection. The connection.
Is it not maybe the way we see the rest of the world sometimes, and with our own prejudices and things like that, For me, an important aspect of an exhibition like this, as you can see in the exhibition, there's no film, for instance. It's all static images. There is so much at the moment in terms, and I went to see the EPA invited me to go and see the Al Gore, isn't it? The film, the sequel, which was a very interesting thing. But for me, we're bombarded with documentaries and moving images, and to me, an exhibition like this, when people have to deal with static images, and you have photography, painting, you have an installation there, and this is for me the idea of the white cube as well. It gives people this moment where they can reflect. You were saying that yourself. I tend not to explain too much about the way I curate an exhibition, about what the artists have to say or don't have to say. For me, it's all about inviting people to look and make their own associations. And yes, it is about climate change, but what is it for you? We had so many people responding to that piece by Vicky Smith there, and not knowing exactly what the artist was trying to do. And I basically threw that question at them. So what is it for you? And this is where you have, when the dialogue starts, basically, with people visiting an art gallery. That's the one thing I want to say about static images, which to me are very important. They give this opportunity for people to be stopped in their tracks and really respond and create their own associations, you know, and again, I've had very interesting conversations with people visiting the exhibitions because they were quite intrigued about some of the works, you know, and that's sort of, I keep talking about the plastic bags, but certainly there's been a lot of very interesting conversations because of this exhibition.
So could I open it a little more to the floor? Has anyone got any issues, questions, thoughts to share?
Okay, back here. To answer your previous question, I've been thinking about it since. I think you're right, actually, and maybe Olivia won't be happy with me for saying this, but for me, anyway, I won't say in general, but for me, art is in the studio, right? And I'm just working with it in the studio, and it's actually a challenge to be asked to do something, you know, about something. I think normally you're just working away, kind of messing around with colours or shapes or whatever you're working on, and it's a different approach to have to say, okay, do something about climate change, or do something about, you know, homelessness or whatever, because it doesn't feel natural to just you know, try and think of something about such and such. For me, anyway, I mean, so it's probably good now. Sorry, I'm going back on my word now. It's probably no harm to force me to think of something different, because you could end up being stuck in the studio, totally divorced from everything that's going on outside. So there's probably no harm for me to be forced in different directions.
I think it's the idea of affiliating. I think that's the word that Aidan Dunn used. The idea of affiliating your practice or your work with a theme. So, and I don't think this is the most challenging exhibition I've done in terms of, you know, we did an exhibition some years ago where I asked the artist to respond to the photography of my great-grand-uncle, who was a photographer during World War I. And I remember one artist saying, but I've never witnessed war. And I said, well, I'm not asking you to respond to war, but to the photography, and there's so many different things about war, you know, displacement of people, you know, building. So it's this idea that when I do a group show like this on a theme, that I would never ask the artist to change their practice or their scope. It's just this idea of responding, I suppose, because you do respond to the world around you anywhere as an artist, right? Mm-hmm. So there's just this, for me the response was actually on words, climate change. Whatever that means to you, by the way. The way I did it as well as I asked the EPA, I said, what kind of information could I give the artist, you know? And we did give the artist some information, but again, for me, it was just those two words. What do they mean, you know? So some of the artists took a different approach. There was an awful lot of research by some of the artists, and some of the artists just, you know, just looked at their own practice, and you know, and so I would hate to think that I'm forcing the artist to. And in fact, it's happened in previous exhibitions where some of the artists told me, "Well, this is not a show for me," and that's actually perfectly all right. Yeah.
Paddy, you were offering.
But I think, Olivier, you put your finger on something also when you mentioned, say, moving images, for example, that the media that people are using and the type of artist you are will depend a lot as to whether or not you may easily get engaged with issues. So it was kind of interesting looking at the Dark Mountain offerings that. While they were fairly varied in their literary style, the writers, the visual artists seem to be mainly the kind of people maybe who do graphic novels, but do graphic novels as art, because that kind of narrative structure lends itself more. And I'm thinking, I came across today, in just looking at what was available on the web, a woman called Jill Pelto, Jill with a J and Pelto, and she has a website with that name, and she uses a kind of very I don't know, I suppose you could call it a hyper-realist style. But she is actually taking graphs, temperature graphs, species decline, species increase graphs, and she's kind of illustrating them in a very, very striking way. Now, it is probably closer to agitprop than art, if you like, but it's an interesting thing I found it an interesting kind of point of reference for what somebody was doing. So yeah, I think I think it does depend on the kind of art you're doing anyway. I mean, it's interesting, somebody like Picasso could move very much from an arts for art's sake position in his own work to being extremely engaged and producing something like the Guernica. You know, whatever you think of the Guernica, it's certainly been an enduring and powerful image. And it's interesting too to look at, going off topic a bit maybe, but what Brian Maguire has been doing, both with the immigrant issue in the Mediterranean or the migrant issue in the Mediterranean, and particularly with his Aleppo paintings. And but Brian has always been an engaged artist. That people he portrays them for a reason, that he wants to say something about our prison system or the way we treat women or whatever.
It's interesting, this idea of being an engaged artist, and to kind of go back to Eoin, I think for me every artist is engaged. I mean, you engage with the world around you, I think, that's what you do. I'm not an artist, never have been, but I suppose you engage with the world around you and you react to it. So whether it's a political engagement or... I work with artists, by the way, that, they would basically tell me I don't give a toss about this or that. I'm a landscape artist, but for me that's still responding to the world around them. I have this artist, Conrad Franco, for instance. And in fact, I use Conrad's at Vue because Conrad had been doing a series of paintings of Italian landscapes. And he was basically painting the purity of the air, of the Italian air near Tuscany or another region in Italy, I can't remember now. And to me that's almost political for me. That's the way I see it anyway, and that's why I'm responding, by the way, to his work, with trying to hijack it.
It's a two-way.
It's a two-way thing, and I think as an artist usually you have to let go as well, It's your work is out there for people to respond to it, and my job as a curator, by the way, is make sure that I'm not hijacking the work of the artist, that yes, I want to facilitate different interpretations, but I'd be very, very aware and careful about the artist's initial reaction. And I talk a lot to the artists that I work with, because certainly I would not try to accessorize their work for whatever, agenda I might have, So this is one thing that I'd be very, very sort of careful, mindful about,
But also because you were saying about the idea of the African art, that it reflects Africa more. I think every artist reflects their environment and their life around them and their emotions and all that subconsciously. No matter how hard you try, your work is going to reflect who you are. So we reflect what Ireland is, and you only have to look at Irish painters in the National Gallery, and they're uniquely Irish. You couldn't mistake them for any other artist from any other country. So I think we can't really deny it.
So just as we move to the closure of this now, we've more or less taken the allotted time. One closing thought that I'd like to offer is that this is not a dark exhibition. It's not dystopian. It's not depressive. I didn't leave the exhibition the couple of times I've been here demotivated. And there was a wonderful expression used by Gordon Cullen, who made paintings of townscape and drawings and so on, serene disquiet. And that was what I get from this show, that a fine artist brings a spiritual attunement and a creative energy, which is sort of the indomitable human spirit, that the human spirit refuses, I think, like Dylan Thomas's green fuse, etc. That vitality is there. And the sense of disquiet is conveyed in a remarkable range of work. And I'm wondering if that is also a cliche about the indomitable spirit, the creative as positive. Is there any validity in that observation about the show?
Syrian Disquiet, is it? That could be the title of the next exhibition.
Okay, well then it remains for me to thank everybody for your patience and your time, and for our panellists who have kindly come along to share their thoughts, and to Olivier for hosting the whole exhibition, and the energy and commitment, ongoing rolling sense of commitment in the Olivier Cornet Gallery. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And just to add, I'm very fortunate. I mean, I work with fantastic artists, so I always say that. I mean, the gallery is absolutely nothing without the artists, but it is true, So it is important to say that. And I just want to finish this by thanking the EPA as well. Without the EPA, I would not have been able to participate in the Vue Art Fair last year. So their commitment to this exhibition and to promoting tonight's exhibition, talk as well, has been tremendous, So thanks everyone for coming tonight. Thank you.